So we're in the book of Daniel. Been plugging along just fine. We've seen a little bit of history. We've seen a little bit of what's going on at the time with Israel. We've seen what's happening with Nebuchadnezzar, who has conquered Judah, has taken the young men. By the way, it did my heart good right before Sunday school on Sunday to have Evan come up to me. That was fantastic. I loved that. It was great. He came up and gave me a hug, came up on stage. I'm like, maybe you need to get used to this stage. Yeah. And then Armando came and got him. It was great. That's the young people. That's the future. Without young people before, without people passing it on, we have nothing today. And so they were trying to go after young people in Babylon to try to convert them. Now, we see this today with young people, don't we? We see an attack on young people specifically to mold and shape them, because they're so impressionable. We see the world really attacking young people, going after them in a lot of different ways and inundating them with being proud of this or identifying as that or listening to this and only having that or don't tell your parents, we'll be in charge, we'll help you with this. It's just this ungodly movement to go after our kids. And unfortunately, the devil doesn't have any sort of new MO. He was doing this through Babylon, and he was going after the young men who were good looking, quick to learn, who could serve in the king's palace. And so, unfortunately, young people have been under attack since Abel. So it's been going on for a while. So we always have to pray for our kids. So that's what we see happening. Well, in the course of time, Daniel is sort of around in the king's palace. The king has a dream. Now, the king does not accidentally have a dream. This is good. This is from God. God has given him this dream. It's a vision. And he's going to let him know a little clue into what's going on. What's going to happen currently? What's going to happen successionally after this? What's going to happen after this? And he's going to clue him in onto some future events, including kingdoms long after Nebuchadnezzar is gone. So we're going to take a look at that. Like anything else, no dream is good without its interpretation. So the king has called the magicians, the sorcerers, the soothsayers, the people who dazzled with their knowledge. He's called them to tell him the dream. Tell me the dream first. Well, that's impossible, as we talked about. And so Daniel has been called to tell him the dream. That's an impossible feat. That's an impossible feat. There's no way. Nobody could, including myself, tell me what I dreamt last night. Okay? I don't know. I'm still on camp time, so I don't know that I'm sleeping that much. We see this impossibility that's when God handles things. That's when God takes over. And our faith in God has to take over during impossible situations. And we've seen this time and time again in our lives. We all have a story of faith in which the impossible has been made possible by God. And so we all have that story. We could all share that. Maybe one night we will. And so Daniel is going to be our beacon of faith as we study him. So he is now before the king, and he is about to do the impossible because of God. And so let's dive in. So we continue to see Daniel persevere in his service to the Lord throughout many events in his life. Now, remember, he has continued his service when the Babylonians, a heathen Gentile nation, invaded his homeland and took many of his countrymen captive. He was forced into a re-education program to alter his mind, to serve false gods, and of course, live the Babylonian way of life. He was promoted because of his knowledge and wisdom. Yay! But he was promoted with the idea that he would take part in the king's delicacies. Hey, we're going to feed you. We're going to give you things. We're going to help you along as part of the re-education program, the reprogramming of the minds of these young men. It's actually sick how people mess with kids. It's actually disgusting and disturbing. And yet we see it still on the rise. But it seems like the quiet things are being talked about out loud now. It seems like there's no holding back on taking. Or read a story where a 6-year-old girl said she knew she was a boy when she was 1 and told her parents. That kind of stuff is disturbing. It's the parents' fault at that point. And so we see this happening more and more today. But we see this re-education program. Daniel refused the king's delicacies and pushed him out of the way. His life was sought because King Nebuchadnezzar could not remember a dream, and he became angry with all the nation's wise men. Now that included Daniel, because he was in this group of people who he went after. If you guys can't interpret it, then I'd just kill them all. And Daniel said, whoa, hold on. He's now about to do the impossible. He's going to tell the king what he dreamed. Now, what's the natural follow-up question? Don't just tell me what I dreamed. What's the next follow-up question? What does it mean? What does it mean? So now, yeah, you've told me what I've seen, which by itself is impossible. Now it's going to be, what does it mean? And so that's coming. So that's the rest of chapter 2. It doesn't stop there. He's also going to give the king the interpretation to the dream that Daniel so fervently sought from God. His character and love for the Lord should be the desire of each and every one of us. Okay. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them into pieces. The iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, the gold, it didn't just knock the statue over. That's too easy, right? That's bowling. That's basic bowling. Could knock something over with a big object. It says that this rock actually crushed them together, mushed them up like powder. They became chaff from the summer threshing floors. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. Now, not to ruin it, but that's the good part right there. Okay, that's the good stuff. So we're going to see what that means. What does that mean? Well, we're going to see. Daniel has in great detail articulated the dream to Nebuchadnezzar. Now, the image was great. And actually, the word was used a couple times to describe it. Again, the Bible never does anything by accident. If the image was great, it was probably great, especially if it says it twice. Brightness, well, unusually brilliant. Radiant, impressive to man, not to be ignored. This word is also translated splendor. You know, there were these large gold, we talked about them, ziggurats. Who remembers the word ziggurat? We talked about that, right? A pyramid. Well, at the top they had gold, and so for miles and miles, sometimes hundreds of miles, the sun would reflect on that gold. I wish we had something gold right here just to see it bright, because it was 102 today, right? It would just glare right off of it, and it would just gleam bright. Well, that's what happened. It's in the desert, so of course it's going to gleam everywhere. Well, that's what this was. It was massive. It was full of splendor. Okay. Awesome. Translated terrible in the King James, it means incredible, unbelievable, so overwhelming that the king almost blocked it from his mind. Like this thing was massive. How many people have been to Washington, D.C.? Anyone? One. You haven't gone to see the Dodgers Nationals over there yet? No. Any other Washington, D.C.? Really? Okay. From what I hear, walking up to the Lincoln Memorial is pretty breathtaking. Pretty overwhelming. Standing at the Washington Monument, pretty overwhelming. Standing at the Vietnam Wall would be pretty overwhelming. That's how I picture this. I picture it huge, massive, and sort of overwhelming to the eyes. Really sort of overloading your brain and overloading your emotion with how massive and incredible, splendor bright this statue was. Even in dreams, we have feelings. Has anyone ever woken up from a dream feeling scared, feeling sad, feeling happy? We have those emotions. So I see him waking up from this feeling in awe of whatever it was he saw. I can't remember, but what did I see? I remember being so impressed by it, this huge image. So the image is made up really of 5 different metals. So let's go through them. What's the first one? Well, of course, it's gold. Gold is the head, the top of what this statue is. The next metal is silver. Silver Oh, not sliver. My bad. So silver was the next metal, and it was the chest area. Bronze is the next one. Of course, we know these metals. We know them pretty well. The Olympics are about to come up, and bronze is equal to last place. And so we see iron being the next one. Iron was a thick, sort of angry, hard metal. A lot of things used for that. And then, of course, clay. Clay was something that is probably out here quite a bit. Probably quite a bit of clay. Probably quite a bit out here. There's probably a lot of, the one picture was looked like it was of the desert. And so see a lot of clay. And so there's your 5 metals that this is made of. Now, down here, we're going to see iron and clay mixed together. We're going to talk about that. That's going to be probably the back half of this lesson. The metals in which the image was composed all deteriorate in value. They deteriorate in magnificence, and they deteriorate in weight from the head to the feet. It began with the precious metal gold and ended up with 2 pretty common elements, clay and iron. Right? Clay, pretty common. They even created an odd version of it called Play-Doh. And so that's kind of a clayish, right? You can buy in different colors. Zion used to eat it. And so it was clay, but then you mix that with iron. Iron is a tough metal, but very common. You saw the picture of the iron workers. That's what they used to build buildings, and it was meant for tall structures, really firm, solid metal, but common, not precious like gold. What is gold right now? About 200 a lot per ounce. And so, what's that? Let's go with a lot per ounce. And so that's more precious. Iron, probably not as valuable, right? Iron might be a couple quarters, 2 bits an ounce, as they used to say back in the day. As Nebuchadnezzar gazed at the image in awe and wonder, he observed a stone being cut without the use of human hands. Now, Nebuchadnezzar observed the stone crash into the base of the feet of this image. The image became crushed into powder and blew away so that no trace of it could be found. The stone then becomes a great mountain, consumes the whole earth. This all seems pretty confusing, okay? But don't forget that the dream isn't a dream without an interpretation, right? One isn't great without the other. And so, miracle that he even told him what he dreamt. And by the way, was spot on with what Nebuchadnezzar dreamed. Oh yeah, that's right. Yep, that's right. Spot on. Now what's the follow-up question? Why? What does it mean? What does it mean? So we're going to get into that. This is the dream. Now, so he ends it with, okay, that's what you dreamt. Great. Here is the interpretation. I'll tell you the interpretation before the king. You, O king, are king of kings. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom. Bookmark that word. We're going to look into that. For the God of heaven has given you a kingdom. God of heaven has given you power. God of heaven has given you strength. God of heaven has given you glory. What does that imply? That God's in control and it's God's to give. Okay? Can't give someone something you don't have. God has those things and gave them to Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, he used Babylon as a tool to punish Judah. The reason why they were there, the reason why the Israelites were there, is because God was punishing Judah for disobedience. 20 kings. It got worse as it went. They were being punished. God was using Babylon to do that. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field, the birds of heaven, he's given them into your hand, and he has made you ruler over them all. Pretty powerful. So if the elements go from highest value to lesser value, then as we're going to see, these kingdoms are going to go from major dominance to dominance. Okay? So we're going to see that as we go along. So made you ruler over all. You are this head of gold. But after you. Oh, so what does that mean? That at some point your kingdom's going to come to an end. So you, great Nebuchadnezzar, are not an eternal king over an eternal kingdom. that at some point somebody's going to come in after you. Shall arise another kingdom, not named Babylon, and that will be inferior to yours. Then another, a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. We're going to talk about him in that group. And the fourth kingdom will be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything. I picture iron kind of like Donkey Kong, right? With the big fist, just kind of clomping around. Iron was a destructive metal. And like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break into pieces and crush all others. We'll look at that. Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided. Yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with clay. Now, of course, those two metals don't cleave together, so we'll see as the toes of the feet were partly iron, partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong, partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere to one another, just as iron does not mix with clay. Interesting how he spends so much time on that one. Okay? And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed. And the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break into pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw that the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and it broke into pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. And then he puts his stamp of approval on it. I got this from God. This is directly from God above. The dream, here's the interpretation. It is certain. It is true. So it's almost like a mic drop, right? I'm out. That's exactly what you dreamt. Here's exactly what it means. So the image itself represents man's kingdoms, or the kingdoms of the world. It's the time of the Gentiles. Now, I often say this, put us in Daniel's shoes. Put ourselves in Daniel's shoes. We're standing before the greatest king in the world, biggest kingdom in the world, the richest king, maybe of all time. Strong king, big king, took over. Maybe he's the greatest, I don't know. Okay, sound like Donald Trump with all these big words. You're standing in front of him, and you have no idea what this king just dreamt. But you're articulating down to detail what he dreamt. And remember, a lot of this is yet future. So now you have no idea. You have no clue what the interpretation means. So Daniel's standing there and giving him this, telling him to his face something that the others couldn't do. Remember, his life is in the balance. So there's additional pressure there. But as we're going to end this, he's relying on God. He's leaning into God. In a difficult moment, we should be leaning into God. We should be putting our faith and trust in him. That's what Daniel did. Life's on the line. He's going to wipe all these people out and start over. I need you to do this. He prays, rallies his friends. It's community, it's prayer, it's putting it out there. God answer me, and God does. That's what it's about. That's why we take prayer requests. That's why we have prayer. So we can rally around each other with prayer. And we can take these things to the God of heaven. So this is the times of the Gentiles. God transferred world power and prominence from Israel to the Gentiles. Now this image represents those kingdoms that God allowed them to build. The real test for prophetical accuracy and legitimacy is in its fulfillment. In current times, we see people claim to speak in tongues, yet no one knows what they say. It's gibberish. The interpretation is the key to all of this. So we see these religious groups that, what does it mean? Doesn't matter. He's filled with something. But it's the interpretation. That's why after the day of Pentecost, when the languages went out, it wasn't that nobody was understanding what they were saying. They were understanding what they were saying. And there's 20 different languages there, and everyone's hearing them in their own language. So it's not just the dream, it's the interpretation that's key. Otherwise, it's just, okay, you dreamt this. So it's the key to all of this. Remember, Daniel knew nothing of the kingdoms he described in his prophecies, except for the one in which he lived. So let's start off. Let's talk about Babylon. The head of gold was the Babylonian Empire under Nebuchadnezzar. Daniel reveals some important facts concerning this empire. It was of God. right? Verse 37, we just talked about it. You, O king, are a king of God. And I have this underlined in my Bible. For the King of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. So Nebuchadnezzar's in charge because God put him in charge. Joe Biden's in charge because God put him in charge. Okay? That's how God operates. What does the Bible say? He lifts up kings, he tears down kings. I've told you the story about George Bush and his approval rating after the Persian Gulf War. Within 12 months, he's out to a hillbilly governor from Arkansas. All of a sudden, he's president. Well, what happened? Well, because God had all of his timing. God speeds things up or slows things down and works out his plan little by little. And so that's what we see with Nebuchadnezzar. Of all the Gentile dominions, Nebuchadnezzar's was the strongest, most powerful, and glorious. Nebuchadnezzar ruled the entire inhabited world. We see that in verse 38. Wherever the children of men dwell, and the beasts of the field, the birds of heaven, he has given them into your hand, and he has made you ruler over all of them. You are this head of gold. Let's go to Jeremiah 27:6, talks about him as well. Jeremiah 27:6. I am not putting as many verses up on the screen because it is still light. So we're going to take advantage of the sunlight while we can, because most of the time it's dark. Jeremiah 27:6, and now I have given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, my servant, and the beasts of the field I have also given him to serve him. So all nations shall serve him, and his son's sons, until the time of his land comes. And many nations and great kings shall make him serve them. God isn't predicting this. God's not hoping for this. He's not Nostradamus. He's dictating this. God's running this. And so that's the difference between someone who in the 70s predicted 9/11 kind of abstractly, or God saying, here's what's going to happen, because God's in charge of it. Nebuchadnezzar ruled with unquestioned authority and enjoyed the most absolute monarchy the world has ever seen. 5:18 and 19. O king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father a kingdom and majesty, glory and honor. And because of the majesty that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whomever he wished, he executed. Whomever he wished, he kept alive. Whomever he wished, he set up. Whomever he wished, he put down. Pretty strong monarchy. He's the guy in charge. Okay? And so we see this strength as the head of gold. City of Babylon itself had mass amounts of gold. The gold represented Babylon very well. Isaiah 14:4. Isaiah 14:4. Shall come to pass in the day the Lord gives you rest from your sorrow and from your fear and the hard bondage in which you were made to serve, that you will take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, how the oppressor has ceased, the golden city has ceased. Okay? Attached to gold. Gold city. This kingdom lasted 70 years, which was the length of time God used to punish Israel. Remember, prior to this captivity, God told, through the prophets, told Judah it will be 70 years. So God already knew that. He knew that going in, that this kingdom would last 70 years. But, as you can see, a pretty mighty and strong 70 years. There it is, map on a map to show this is east of Rialto. Okay? Unless you go the other way, then it's west of Rialto. Okay? Depends on which way you go. Either way, it's a long ways away, but this was there. This, of course, is Saudi Arabia. And so we see Northern Africa, Egypt. Okay, so pretty big. Snapshot this in your brain as we go through the next three. Okay, pretty big. That's pretty impressive, right? There's Judah, there's Jerusalem, etc. Capital city of Babylon. Okay, which is in modern day Iraq. Silver. The chest and arms were made of silver. Now this represented the Medo-Persian dynasty, which lasted from 539 to 331. The Babylonian kingdom was seized from Belshazzar, current king of Babylon, by Darius the Mede. Back to Daniel, or over to Daniel 5. You see this happening. I hope I'm not ruining anything, but this is how the book continues. For those who don't know, spoiler alert. 531 says, that very night. Now remember, we get the term, the writings on the wall, right? That term. Oh, well, you could see the writing on the wall. That's why he was fired, right? Or he quit before he was fired, right? That's what all this is. And so that night, Belshazzar, who was in charge of Babylon at that time, God says, your kingdom is done. That very night, Belshazzar, king of the Chaldeans, was slain. Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. So we see that in Daniel 5:30. A treaty and agreement to law united the empires of Media and Persia. This union was much inferior to the kingdom ruled by Nebuchadnezzar because their laws bound the kings of Media and Persia. 615 says, these men approached the king and said, King, know, O king, that it is the law of the Medes and Persians that no decree or statute which the king established may be changed. Powerful, not as powerful. You got one guy making the call versus now you have to consider two different kingdoms. Obviously, the more cooks in the kitchen, the more challenging it is. And so we see that with this. Strong, not as strong. And that's why I think the two arms. It's interesting to note 2 Chronicles 36:20 and Isaiah 44 into Isaiah 45, how even the reign of Cyrus and the kingdom of Persia were foretold by God. God calls them out by name, which is crazy. But God does that knowing what's coming. Okay? So let's just turn over to the 2 Chronicles 36:21. 2 Chronicles 36:20. And those who escaped from the sword, he carried away to Babylon, where they became servants to him and his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia. And in the Isaiah 44 and 45, one mentions Cyrus by name. So God, well aware of what's going to happen, well aware of who he's going to raise up and knock down. The books of Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah can be studied to learn more about this kingdom. Actually, maybe a lot of people don't put it together, but the very famous story of Daniel, which is what? The lion's den. That's right. Daniel lion's den happens under this kingdom. I believe in Daniel 6. So we'll study that. History notes that Darius was the uncle of Cyrus. Doesn't like a little nepotism. It was also said that the Persian army was known as the Silver Army because of the silver corsets of armor that they wore. Again, not coincidental. You see these silver corsets coming at you. You're like, why are there dudes wearing corsets? And then you're like, oh my goodness, they have swords. Let's run. That's pretty much the reaction to when you saw dudes wearing silver corsets coming at you. Much bigger space. A little further north, a little further east, much bigger area of dominance. You've got a couple of entities melding together, double the dominance. They can go after it. Okay. What's crazy is the kingdom that takes him down, the kingdom that takes them down is basically one dude. And so we're going to see that. So here we needed these two kingdoms to overtake Babylon. It's going to be one guy who's going to take over the Persian Empire. Everyone doing okay? Everyone doing okay? Any questions? Comments, thoughts? Anyone? 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 Okay. The belly and thighs, which were made of brass or bronze, was the Grecian Empire under the rule of Alexander the Great. Born in 356 BC in Macedonia, he became king at the age of 20. He being Alexander the Great. Became king at the age of 20 following his father, Philip II's assassination in 336. That's you, you're Philip II. He was tutored by as Bill and Ted's called him, the philosophizer, but the philosopher Aristotle from age 13 to 16, which instilled in him a love of knowledge, logic, philosophy, culture. He was on a dominant, he was on a trek to win. He wanted to learn. He wanted to assimilate. He wanted to bring in, he wanted to incorporate all of this stuff. We see this mentality in Acts. We see this mentality when Paul goes to Mars Hill and, hey, there's something new coming at us. There was this desire for knowledge. Well, learning at the feet of someone like Aristotle, who liked to bring and give and take in and give out philosophy and poetry and maybe limericks. I don't know. But like there was an exchange of information, exchange of knowledge. And so Alexander was primed for that. As king of Macedonia, Alexander quickly consolidated power and embarked on an ambitious campaign of conquest that would create one of the largest empires in the ancient world. Really, he liked to fight to win. He was just a fighter for the sake of fighting. In just over a decade, by 30, Alexander had conquered the massive Persian Empire. Remember, we saw that, including territories in Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, and stretching his rule from Greece all the way to northwest India. It is said that even though he did this quickly, his armies were often outnumbered 100 to 1. But they were that efficient, strong, powerful under his leadership. We also know that he was undefeated in battle. He never lost a battle his entire time, and is considered one of the greatest military commanders in history. It's funny because he was kind of compassionate, but kind of ruthless. He was just, he sort of flipped. Like sometimes when they would approach him, they really wouldn't know what they would get. Are we going to get compassionate, Alex? Are we going to get angry, Alex? Like, which one are we getting? Do we call him King the Great? Is that his last name? Which one are we getting? And sometimes he'd go into a land and conquer them and just say, burn it all, kill them all, take them all. Other times he'd be like, well, these people seem nice and peaceful. Let's bring them in and assimilate him in. He was sort of up and down in that regard. He desired to conquer the world simply for the sake of victory on the battlefield. I mean, who doesn't like that, right? Who doesn't like to compete? I don't know about on the battlefield, but who doesn't like to compete and go after it? It's sort of the thrill of victory. It was that sort of adrenaline high that he would get from winning on the battlefield. He founded over 70 cities, not surprisingly named many after himself. The armies of Alexander were brazen coated. They were brass armors, brass swords, and helmets that were coated with brass. The kingdom extended further than the prior kingdoms. One philosophizer wrote that Alexander ruled a small empire at the age of 20 and ruled the world by the age of 30. I could not have done either. I remember being 20. I remember being 30. Impossible. I was still learning how to tie my shoes in both of those ages. He dominated and conquered in a very small amount of time. Perhaps the thighs represent swift movement or quickness. Now, we're going to see a later vision. We're going to see a very quick animal with wings. We're going to see that later on, talking about these same kingdoms. And so I believe because it was in such a small amount of time, I believe there was speed. Maybe that's why we see the legs. Certainly describe the quickness and speed in which he dominated this Mede and Persian Empire and had really taken that over and then just started to expand. He loved the battle, and so he expanded his kingdom. He died in 323 of a fever. That's all that's known. Some have speculated it could be other things, but he died of a fever at age 32, and the empire was divided among his 4 generals. That's where it fell apart. Remember, you have one guy in charge, sounds good. He's your guy. He's doing it, like we saw with Nebuchadnezzar. You get a couple, Alexander's in charge. Pretty quick, great leader, military guy, left to 4 generals. That's why there's a next empire. So you can see the expansion here as well, a little bit further northwest this time, expanding up based in Greece. I did not do a search on this, but I'd be curious to know how many towns were renamed after Alexander was out. How many Alexandrias were renamed after the next group took over? Okay, we'll go one more. Iron. The legs of iron represent the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire began in 27 BC when Octavian, later known as Augustus, became the first Roman emperor. It lasted in the West until 476 AD, when the last Western Roman emperor was deposed. The Eastern Roman Empire, that's the split. It split into 2 parts. The Eastern Roman Empire, also known as the Byzantine Empire, continued until the 15th century. So it splits into two powerful entities. What does that look like? Legs, okay? At its height under Emperor Trajan. Now we're getting into some New Testament times. Now we're getting, Romans were in charge when Christ came to the earth, remember? When the apostles were there, when he began his ministry, when he began his church during his ministry, when all of this was going on, the book of Acts all takes place under Roman rule. And so the empire stretched across Europe, North Africa, and parts of the Middle East. It included territories in modern-day Britain, Spain, France, Germany, the Balkans, Greece, Turkey, Syria, Egypt, and North Africa. So they expanded up and over all the way to Great Britain. The empire was divided into provinces governed by appointed officials. What's interesting about this is much of our government comes from this government. You have sort of a one person, they had a cabinet, there were governors, people in different territories. We see this in the Bible mentioned. We see that concept of sort of a government tree. We see much of that. Greece and Rome both had like a Supreme Court, people who were sort of weighing things as they were coming in. Much of our country's blueprint comes from these rules, these kingdoms. Under Roman rule, the world trembled. Iron typifies strength, brute force, and brutality. It was an organized machine, even by today's standards. Did they have drones you could control from your phone that are precision GPS? Of course not. But they would march in unison. They would dominate in unison. They were singular of mind. As I mentioned before, it's sort of like they assimilated people into one collective and just went marching. I picture it like a lawnmower. You're just mowing them over. That's how the Roman government was. It bruised the other nations that it conquered, including Jerusalem, of course, in AD 70 when Titus ransacked the city. The legs suggest a division of this mighty empire into east and west. This kingdom would be strong as iron and would break into pieces the other kingdoms. Now, the Western Empire lasted only 500 years, but the Eastern Empire lasted into the 15th century. No one conquered the Roman Empire. It really fell from within. And though crumbled as a world monarchy, Rome is still with us, not only in law, in language and culture, of course, worldwide influence through the Catholic Church, which we are studying that in the Trail of Blood. Constantine was the ruler of the Roman Empire when he called together his meeting and partnered with this upstart Catholic Church to spread, quote, Christianity throughout the world. That was his idea in the 4th century. We studied this in the Trail of Blood. So obviously they're still with us. Much more dominant, much bigger area. You can feel the map zooming out with every single one. You have to zoom out to see everything that's there. Okay. Let's get to the good stuff next week. Let's pause that. Let's pause it right there. We'll call it good for tonight. We're going to get to the iron mixed with clay. We're going to reread those 3 verses in Daniel 2. We'll talk about that. Well, some videos. Got some videos coming up. Got some good stuff that I think will sort of shed some light on maybe who these guys are. It seems to be that this coalition is still yet future for us. Everything except for the head of gold was yet future for Daniel and for Nebuchadnezzar, who's hearing the interpretation. This one is still yet future for us. And so we'll talk about that next week.